There is an industry that has quietly become one of the most powerful forces in the American economy. It owns hospitals where you get treated, apartment buildings where you live, veterinary clinics where you take your dog, and nursing homes where your parents end up. It has bought and sold over 8,000 American companies in the last decade alone. And the way it makes money has almost nothing to do with making those companies better, stronger, or more competitive. In fact, in many cases, the worse the company does, the more money the people running it walk away with. I'm talking about private equity, and by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how the machine works, why it keeps producing the same outcome over and over, and why the people getting hurt are almost never the people running the fund. Let's start with a story. Because in 2005, Toys R Us was not a dying company. It was struggling. Yes. Amazon was eating into its sales. Yes. But it had over $11 billion in annual revenue, 1,500 stores globally, and a brand that every person over the age of 25 has an emotional memory attached to. And then 3 private equity firms, KKR, Vornado, and Bain Capital, bought it in a leveraged buyout for $6.6 billion. Here is the part that should stop you cold. Of that $6.6 billion purchase price, the private equity firms put up roughly $1.3 billion of their own money. The rest, about $5 billion, was borrowed. And that debt was not put on the PE firm's balance sheets. It was loaded directly onto Toys R Us itself. The company that was bought now owed the money used to buy it. Let that sentence sit for a moment. You buy a house, you take out a mortgage. But instead of the mortgage being your problem, you make the house pay for itself. You extract rent, charge fees, and when the house eventually collapses under the weight of payments it cannot afford, you walk away and say the real estate market was just too competitive. That is a leveraged buyout, and it is the foundational transaction of private equity. So Toys R Us is now carrying $5 billion in debt, paying $400 million a year in interest. That is $400 million a year that cannot go to new stores, better technology, competitive e-commerce infrastructure, or anything that might actually help the company survive. For 13 years, Toys R Us tried to compete with Amazon and Walmart, while bleeding out $400 million annually in interest payments on debt. It took on not because it needed to grow, but because 3 firms needed a financing structure that worked for them. In 2017, Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy. 33,000 employees lost their jobs. Many of them lost healthcare. The PE firms had already extracted hundreds of millions in fees and advisory charges over the years of ownership. They did not lose 33,000 jobs. They lost a bet. And even then, they did not lose that much. This is not an isolated story. This is a pattern. Sears Pier 1, Payless Shoe Source, Gymboree, Fairway Market, All Saints, Brookstone. The list of companies that went bankrupt after private equity acquisitions is long enough to fill a eulogy that would take hours to read. A study by the American Investment Council found that PE-backed companies go bankrupt at a rate roughly twice that of comparable non-PE-owned businesses. Twice. And yet the industry manages $12 trillion in assets globally and is still growing, which means either the people funding it have not done the math, or they have done a different kind of math entirely. To understand why this keeps happening, you need to understand the actual incentive structure of a private equity fund. Because the problem is not that PE managers are evil. The problem is that the system rewards a very specific set of behaviors, and those behaviors are not always aligned with keeping companies alive. Here is how a standard PE fund works. A PE firm raises a fund, typically targeting a 10-year life cycle. They call up pension funds, university endowments, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, and high net worth investors and say, "Give us your capital, and we will generate superior returns." The fund managers collect a management fee, typically 2% of committed capital per year, regardless of performance. On a $10 billion fund, that is $200 million a year in fees before they have done anything. Then they go buy companies using that capital plus a lot of borrowed money. The debt goes on the company. The fees keep coming. Then when they eventually sell the company or take it public, they collect carried interest, which is typically 20% of the profits above a hurdle rate. And carried interest, historically, has been taxed at the capital gains rate, which is lower than ordinary income tax rates, meaning a PA fund manager earning hundreds of millions in carried interest pays a lower tax rate than the teacher or nurse who works at one of the companies they own. This is not a loophole that slipped through by accident. It is a feature that has survived decades of reform attempts, because the people who benefit from it are very good at funding the campaigns of the people who would have to close it. Now here is where it gets structurally sinister, because the 2% management fee and the 20% carry create a very specific pressure. The fund has a 10-year clock. It needs to buy companies, do something with them, and exit within that window to realize its returns. That timeline has almost nothing to do with what is actually good for the company being bought, or the people who work there. A business that needs 15 years of patient investment to reach its potential is not a great private equity target. A business that can be bought, have costs slashed, debt loaded on, dividends extracted, and sold in 5 years. That is the sweet spot, which means the entire selection and management logic of PE is tilted towards short-term extraction over long-term building. And there is a specific technique called a dividend recapitalization that illustrates exactly how far this can go. Here is how it works. A PE firm buys a company. The company is doing okay, generating decent cash flow. Instead of using that cash flow to pay down the debt already on the company, the PE firm has the company take on even more debt and uses the proceeds to pay a special dividend directly to the PE fund. The company gets more leveraged. The fund gets cash out immediately. The risk goes up for employees, suppliers, and creditors. The reward goes directly to the firm that engineered the whole thing. A 2020 study found that between 2015 and 2019, PE-owned companies paid out over $188 billion in dividend recapitalizations. $188 billion extracted from companies and handed to fund managers and investors, funded by debt loaded onto the businesses that had to keep operating under that weight. And then when some of those businesses fail, the story becomes the retail apocalypse, or the disruption of traditional industries, or shifting consumer preferences. Rarely does the story become the company was carrying $4 of debt for every dollar of equity, because someone needed a Q3 distribution. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but surely someone is watching this. Surely regulators are on top of it. And the answer is, kind of occasionally, with significant gaps and significant lobbying pressure working against it. Private equity firms are not subject to the same disclosure requirements as public companies. When a PE firm buys a hospital or a nursing home, there is often no requirement to publicly disclose the ownership structure, the fee arrangements, or the debt levels being imposed on the facility. A 2021 study in the Journal of the American Medical Association found that private equity acquisition of nursing homes was associated with a 10% increase in short-term mortality among residents. 10%. And the ownership information was so opaque in many cases that researchers had to spend months building ownership databases just to run the analysis. This is healthcare. These are human beings. And the argument being made in congressional testimony, when it gets that far, is essentially that private equity brings efficiency and capital to underserved sectors, which is partially true. PE does invest in businesses that might not otherwise get funding, and some PE-owned companies do grow, do improve, and do generate real returns. This is not an argument that all private equity is uniformly destructive. It is an argument that the incentive structure of the industry systematically produces a subset of outcomes that are catastrophic for workers, communities, and sometimes patients, and that those outcomes are not accidents or unfortunate side effects. They are what the math produces when you combine short time horizons, fee structures that pay regardless of outcome, and the ability to load downside risk onto the acquired company. And here is the final layer that should make every pension holder uncomfortable. The largest investors in private equity funds are pension funds. The California Public Employees Retirement System, known as CalPERS, has billions allocated to private equity. So does the New York State Pension Fund. So does virtually every major public pension in the country, which means the teachers, firefighters, and public employees whose pension capital is funding PE buyouts are the same population most likely to work at or rely on the hospitals, nursing homes, and service companies being acquired. Your retirement savings are, in part, funding the machine that is buying the infrastructure your retirement depends on, loading it with debt, and paying itself before asking whether the business survives. The circularity of that is either darkly poetic or just dark, depending on how much coffee you have had today. So what do you do with this? Because outrage without action is just a hobby. First, if you are an employee and your company gets acquired by a PE firm, pay attention to the debt levels being announced immediately after the deal closes. If the acquired company is suddenly carrying billions in new debt, the timeline to cost, cutting, layoffs, and restructuring is not a question of if but when. Second, if you have any visibility into your pension fund's allocations, it is worth understanding how much is going into private equity and what the track record of those specific firms looks like. Not all PE is equivalent. Some firms have long records of genuine value creation. Others have long records of fee, extraction, followed by bankruptcy. The data is harder to access than it should be, but it exists. Third, if you are a policymaker or you vote for them, carried interest tax treatment and PE disclosure requirements are two specific levers that reformers have pushed on for years. Neither requires dismantling the industry. Both would change the incentives in ways that might reduce the frequency of the Toys R Us outcome. Because the goal here is not to argue that capital allocation is bad, it is to argue that the current rules of the game create a system where the person who loads a company with debt and walks away pays a lower tax rate than the person who loses their job as a result. And that asymmetry is a policy choice, not a law of nature. So I want to hear where you land on this. Do you think private equity is a necessary and mostly productive part of the capital markets that gets unfairly blamed for broader economic disruptions? B, a structurally predatory industry whose incentives guarantee collateral damage regardless of individual intentions, or C, somewhere in between. Occasionally useful but badly in need of disclosure and tax reform. Drop your take in the comments because this is one of those topics where smart people land in very different places, and the debate is a lot more interesting than the headlines suggest. And the next time you see a beloved company file for bankruptcy, before you blame the internet or changing tastes, check who bought it 5 years ago and check what they did with the debt, because the answer is usually not a mystery. It is just buried in a footnote.